Hi, this is Dr. Patrick Russell, and we're going to talk about narrative criticism in this video presentation. Now, the reason to go through narrative criticism is because, of course, you have to write a paper using this methodology. And you may be wondering, well, why? Why do you have to use this methodology? I give you three reasons. The first reason is simply that here in your studies, we typically in our curriculum emphasize the historical critical methods. You're very well versed in those methods, but you might not be familiar with narrative criticism or even have used narrative criticism in any extensive fashion. So it seems to be appropriate that before you graduate, you have that experience to engage what is typically called a synchronic exegetical method versus what we tend to emphasize, which are the diachronic methods. Just for your intellectual formation to fill it out, it would be important to have this coverage of this method. Secondly, in terms of, I'd say, spiritual and pastoral formation, this method has some possible resources for you. I find it helpful myself, even though I'm not a narrative critic. It's not the methodology I prefer to use, but I do appreciate it. And one of the reasons is that it points out things in the text that I don't necessarily notice if I use its methods. Sometimes we have this tendency to have read the text become so familiar to us that we overlook some of the features of it, or even some of the questions that might arise from the text because we have sort of ready answers for them. Well, this method, looking at the text from a different angle, sort of raises up some of those new questions. And I think that's really valuable for the spiritual life, to see how the text might speak anew to us. Sometimes we've gone through text so many times and have studied the background of various passages or pericopes that we say, oh, yeah, this means X. But to use a new method, and particularly a method like narrative criticism, it really drills down on how the narrative functions. So you really pay attention to how the story works. Can really open up new insights in the text, which I find very enriching to take that into prayer and just to get a greater sense of how the Word of God is revealing God's desire for us for our sake of our salvation. Connected to that, I'd say it has value in terms of pastoral formation. Most of you are preparing to preach, preparing to be priests, serving in the church, and parish life is busy, and you may not, on a Monday morning as you get ready to say the 7 o'clock weekday mass or whatever, have time to dig into the commentaries. And if you're looking to have some way to prepare that's efficient, so you're not just performing eisegesis, but you're really basing your homily on some sort of exegesis. Well, narrative criticism gives you some tools that you can use that doesn't require a lot of extra reading, but in fact you can use them to look at the text, see what emerges from the text. But it gives you, since they are tools, since they are a method, gives you some constraints to what you pull out of the text. It gives you, if you will, a particular lens to look at the text, so you can feel like it's not just you reading into the text, but you're allowing the text to emerge, the meaning of the text to emerge from the text. So I think it can be very helpful in a busy parish priest life to use narrative criticism sometimes, particularly I think weekday masses, to prepare for your homilies. The third and final reason I would say why we want to have you engage narrative criticism in this class is because you might find it hard. You may find it hard to think in a narrative critical way. We've done a really nice job, most likely, to hone your skills to think in a historical critical fashion. And this methodology can seem baffling to some students because it is taking a totally different angle of the text. I find this particularly valuable, therefore, to use in the Gospel of John, because I've emphasized over and over again as we've gone through the course about how John is a gospel that forces you to look at things from a different angle, from a different perspective. That if you don't get it, recalibrate your lenses, your perception of things, you'll miss the reality that's underneath, that's within what's in front of you. So, kind of being shaken out of our preconceived notions, and our assured judgments, and our maybe our rigid values, whatever, to see things from a different perspective, to start to see, oh, here's a new way that I got to kind of break out of my preconceived ideas so that I can see the text anew. I think that has value because it kind of engages you with the experience that I think the gospel writer of John believes one has to do to enter into faith. That if you're trapped within those sort of moribund categories, then you can't see the reality of God's work within the world. So, again, this is a method, I think, because it forces you to kind of think in a different way, through different lenses, is very apropos for use here in the study of the Gospel of John. So we'll walk through narrative criticism, and the plan would be to look at first narrative criticism within, very quickly, in a very broad stroke sort of fashion, within the history of exegesis. And then we'll look at its theoretical principles. Then we'll look at some of the methodologies that are employed to do narrative criticism. And then we'll specifically talk about the paper you need to write using narrative critical methodology. So let's start off with narrative criticism within the history of exegesis. So, as you're probably well aware, we can start the story back in of modern critical biblical studies back in the mid 19th century and early 20th centuries. And during that time, that the methods that really continued to dominate for about 150 years were first formulated and came to kind of prominence. And really what was the impetus in that period of time was this sort of frustration with these multiple and competing interpretations of Scripture coming from one's denominational perspective. And so really, in many ways, the diachronic methods, the early modern critical methodologies, were seeking what is the one true meaning of the text. The true meaning of the text was really the goal, right? The sense is, okay, well, we have these sort of ecclesiastical lenses we put over the text, but what is the text, if it was just to speak on its own terms, might it say? And so there was developed, therefore, and particularly how it might say things through understanding how the text itself came to be, how it came to be formed. So, very much focusing upon the original history of the text. And so various methods were developed, such as source criticism, form criticism, redactional criticism, and tradition history criticism. You're probably well familiar with these methods, these historical critical, what have been called now historical critical methods. Although, interestingly enough, when they are first developed, oftentimes they're referred to as literary critical methods, because the goal was to figure out how the literature, the literary text came to be. So you looked at sources and saw how they might be used to create the literary text. That was seen as a literary critical method by many and identified as such that way. But again, probably over time, we tend to talk about those as historical critical methods. And what the attempt was in those methods was to shift the interpretive framework from what might be called the plain meaning of the text or ecclesial interpretive context to the historical context. We already kind of made mention of that. And that was kind of the goal. If we can see what was the historical impetus for the text and what the historical author was trying to communicate through the text, then that can give us a sense of truly what the text is trying to reveal, what its meaning is. And you can see in this, right, very much Dei Verbum's emphasis. This next box here, determine what the goal was, determine what, that is an event or a thing, the historical author's culturally conditioned intention was in determining the text meaning. So the goal was to determine what was the historical author's intention in terms of what he was trying to communicate through the text. Yeah, right? I mean, that's basically what Dei Verbum paragraph section 12 says. Is how we find out what God was trying to reveal. Was what did the historical author intend to communicate, and then that's important to therefore then figure out what God is trying to communicate. That's the first step in figuring that out. All right. So these texts, because these methodologies, because their interest in history, are typically called diachronic methodologies, and that word dia through chronos, we know that word time, through a diachronic. So you're trying to get to the meaning of the text through time. And its underlying principles, let's see if we can get rid of that. The underlying principles were that they stem from modernism confidence in retrieving objective facts and truth from history, right? That history itself could be understood, could be studied. Of course, this was also due to sort of the in the 19th century, this whole sort of project to reclaim sources and get back to original sources. Well, this is part of it, but it also had the sense that you could come to know, history in an objective fashion. And, of course, during the same time, right, think about the late 19th century, you have the emergence of evolutionary theory. So you do kind of have hand in glove with these methods, sort of depending upon an evolutionary worldview, scientific worldview. So therefore, think about those methods we walked up through: source criticism, form criticism, redaction criticism. It's going sort of through the compositional stages of the text, right? That the text sort of evolves within this. Okay, so that's what kind of was underlining the diachronic methods in terms of their philosophical principles. Now, if we go to the synchronic methodologies, and particularly narrative criticism, but narrative criticism is one of a kind of a basket of methodologies that emerged starting in the 70s, really came to their own in the 80s, but some of these that I'll talk about, their history more is rooted in the 70s. But particularly narrative criticism is really the 80s that it came to the fore, when I was actually in graduate school. And so it was the new thing. So first off, how does it vary from the diachronic methodologies? Well, they had the same frustration, the frustration with multiple competing interpretations, but not because of denominational, kind of lenses that seem to dictate what the understanding of the text was, but rather because from modern biblical scholarship, that one of the frustrations that was explicitly identified in those 1970s, 80s period was we have to get, if you looked at historical critical scholars' interpretations and exegetical work, they came up with a plurality of understandings of what the one meaning was. You didn't have uniform conclusions. And this frustrated many of the biblical scholars that was the goal. The goal was to find the real meaning, the one, which was in some ways defined as one meaning. Instead, we've gotten a plurality of interpretations of the text. We have different scholars arguing different ways of understanding the text in very fundamental ways using historical critical methods. So that desire was still there to find the one true meaning. Well, instead of using, therefore, the diachronic methods, they did things, what started to emerge was using of canonical criticism. Well, let's just read it within the Bible as a whole. That was, again, started in the 70s and continued into the 80s and even today. There was a movement that really didn't last real long called structuralism. It was a very formal way of analyzing the text, almost mathematically or almost, I'd say, using geometry in some ways because they had all these graphs and everything they'd use, these diagrams to kind of understand the text, kind of diagram like you used to diagram sentences, they kind of diagram the stories like that. That didn't last too long, but that was in the 70s. But then emerged in the 80s, really starting about 82 and then on, was narrative criticism. And then there's also reader response and some other kind of criticisms you could throw into this basket. But we're going to focus upon narrative criticism. As I said, when I was a graduate student, it really was kind of narrative criticism was a new method, just coming into its own. And the goal here was to shift the interpretive framework from the historical context to the ahistorical meaning, which was the text itself. They wanted to focus upon the literary nature of the text because that's fixed, right? That doesn't change. And so maybe if it doesn't change, then it doesn't have the variables of history affecting it like it would with the diachronic methods, which results in multiple interpretations. If we just look at the text as an object, as a text, then maybe we can come up with this one true meaning. And so, and it wasn't interested in kind of reading it historically, because that results in these multiple interpretations, competing interpretations. So we'll just say, how does the text itself function, and what does the text communicate? And we should be able to get to one meaning, right? Because the text is fixed. So what they were interested in wasn't looking at the what. They didn't want to determine the what, which is the case with the diachronic methods, but the how. How does this ahistorical text in and of itself literarily create for what they call the implied reader, who's not the real reader, right? Because the real reader has different understandings of the text. But and we're going to talk more about the implied reader, but this is the reader that is implied by the text itself, that sort of emerges from the text itself. So what, trying to figure out how the text kind of creates for the implied reader meaning. And then we'll know what the one true meaning is. It's kind of the sense. And so these methods are called synchronic. So syn in Greek, with, and of course chronos, time. So instead of going through time, you're going with time. The text is congruent with our time, right? We're not going to give it any historical distance. We're one and the same time, because we're just dealing with the text, and the text, in some ways, is a object that it doesn't have to be constrained by time. In some ways, is kind of the thought here. And let me move my little face here, so you can see what I'm about to talk about here. But the underlying philosophical principles here was, this arose when postmodernism was starting to get its footing, and there was a real skepticism about whether you find objective truth and facts, particularly when dealing with history. Can we really understand what someone 2,000 years ago was thinking? It's hard to know what my wife's thinking, or my son's thinking, or one of my students are thinking. How do I presume I can figure out what someone who's dead for 2,000 years was thinking when they wrote this text? So there was a skepticism that, in fact, you could retrieve the truth, or even the actual facts of how the text came to be. And this was walking hand in glove with also this sort of critique of objectivity in and of itself. This philosophical focus upon the subjective is all that really is, right? That meaning is subjective. This can lead to relativism, but the sense that the subject, right, the human person makes meaning, and there's no outside of the person's making meaning, there's no sort of objective reality beyond that. So even though I wouldn't say this is where these methods were trying to go, they are kind of in this milieu, coming out of this milieu, and in some ways they're trying to, because they don't think we can recover the historical intentions or motivations of the author. Then if we get rid of that, we can find out, in fact, what the text is trying to say, and that might avoid some subjectivism. But it's certainly part of this whole context that this method came about. All right, so that gives you a little bit of a sense of narrative criticism within the history of exegesis. Let's move to its theoretical principles. And what did narrative critics say? Now I'll have to move myself one more time, get myself down there, which I should be pretty good down there from now on. Okay, so the first thing they say, which we've kind of already intonated, which is that events and persons behind the text are irretrievable. The skepticism about history, the doing of history, particularly in terms of understanding what people were really thinking and intending. And they would say, therefore, that the text itself creates meaning separate from its historical origins and its social context, right? So you can pick up any book from, you can pick up Shakespeare and not know anything about Shakespeare, nothing about Elizabethan England, and the text can make sense to you, right? You can pick up Odysseus and not know anything about Greek culture and figure out what the story is saying, right? So their argument is that the text itself communicates meaning, you don't need an historical context to make sense of it, right? The subject, here you go with that subject, the subject itself can figure out the meaning of the text. So this is a second theoretical principle. The third theoretical principle is that the meaning of the text can be ascertained by examining how the implied reader, here's that term again, makes sense of the narration from the way that the implied author, who's not the real author, the implied author, again, this is an author who's kind of emerges from the text, structures or unfolds the plots, events, dialogues, and characters, etc. All right? So since they wanted to get away from the idea of a real reader, and this is where it might differentiate from reader response, which is talking about how a person does hear the story, a real person hears the story and responds to it. They don't want to get to the they're leery about grounding the text of the meaning just in the subjective experience of the person, because that, you fall into subjectivism. So they have this disembodied implied reader. And implied author. So let's unpack that here with principle number 4. The implied reader and the implied author are not the historical first reader or the historical actual author. Those are called real reader and the real author, right? So that's not what we're talking about. That's not the implied reader nor the implied author. And that is kind of a key, that you keep this separation between what's the implied author and reader versus the real reader and the real author. So the implied reader and author are implied or indicated or significated by the text itself. All right? So, if you will, the implied reader emerges from the text. Sort of this disembodied, amorphous, non-historical placeholder that is used to talk about how the text makes meaning. Right? And the implied author is not a real author. It's basically how the text constructs itself, how the text is constructed, and for a handy placeholder to understand that process by which the text is, so referring to how the text sort of creates meaning in terms of its compositional style. You can talk about the implied author, who's not the real author. It's not the person who actually wrote it down. It's just the text itself. From the text itself, we can get a sense that there's some authoritarian intention, or at least compositional strategy. Right? Does that make sense? This is a place where people tend to start to scratch their heads. And key concept. So the implied reader is not a real reader. It's not you. It's not me. It's not even a human being. It's the reader who is sort of this non-embodied reality that is coming to understand the meaning of the text based upon how the story unfolds. So, the point here is that by delineating and explicating the story elements, narrative criticism strives to reconstruct the implied author's efforts to effect, that means to, so not affect, because that's getting to feelings, right? But effect the implied reader in terms of value judgments, beliefs, and perceptions. That is the text meaning, right? So that's what narrative criticism is trying to do. All right. If we go to the next, there we go. Okay. So that's the theoretical principles. Now let's get into the exegetical methodologies. If those principles are confusing, we might need to talk about them more, but at least that's the principles, right? So in terms of the exegetical methodologies, given those principles, here's sort of the exegetical guidelines of what they're trying to achieve. So first off, narrative criticism is an attempt to describe such things as plot, narrative gaps, characterization, rhetorical devices, etc., so as to explain how the narrative, on the level of narrative, creates meaning. Right? We never leave the level of narrative. The exegete is not attempting to ascertain the real author's purpose or the real author's response, but that of the implied author and the implied reader. Okay? Now, I find it really important when you write your paper to always use the word implied author and implied reader. Don't just say reader and author, because that kind of holds you to this idea that you're dealing with not a real reader and not a real author, but this implied reader who's implied by the text, right? Implied by the text. So second guideline. The meaning of the text comes only from the narrative itself, not from outside knowledge of the text's original culture, history, etc. The implied reader knows nothing of that, right? If you start importing, and sometimes I see this in narrative criticism, which sort of is like fingernails against a blackboard for me because they're just not being methodologically consistent. The implied reader doesn't know any of that. You know, we do that all the time. We start reading about the Samaritan woman, like, oh yeah, Samaritans, oh yeah, I know their history. When Assyria invaded the north and sent the people into exile, they brought in people from other parts of their empire and they intermarried and da-da-da-da, right? When you're doing a narrative criticism of the Samaritan woman, you can't talk about that at all, that historical background, because the implied reader knows nothing of that. The only thing the implied reader knows up to chapter 4, where the Samaritan woman at the well story begins, is what the implied reader has been told from chapter 1, verse 1. Okay? Now, what the tricky part of that is, does the implied reader know Greek? This text was originally written in Greek. If he knows Greek, we know anything about languages, the meaning of words changes over time, right? Because of culture. It becomes even more complex when we're dealing with English. Does the implied reader know English? If so, how much English? And how much, is it that Elizabethan English or is it a modern 21st century American English? So right away, you kind of see one of the methodological rubbing points, which is, we want to just read the text as text, but how does the implied reader even read if he doesn't have a cultural context, right? Because these words only have meaning within a culture, within some sort of relational sphere. But that's a big methodological question. We won't have to solve that for our purposes. But this is one of the key kind of questions. If you say, you can't use culture, you can't use history, well then where do you draw the line just in terms of how the reader knows what the words mean? Because right away you're already kind of importing some cultural, historical data. And if you're, so you get the point. So, but for our purposes, we will assume that the implied reader had a solid understanding of the semantic meaning of English, since most of you are just going to be doing this in English, and that's all I expect your narrative critical paper to work with an English text. And Koine Greek. If you want to use the Greek, you can, in some ways to make some point, you can dabble into that, not expect it. Okay? Then the third exegetical guideline is that the text constructs its meaning in a cumulative fashion. I kind of already gave an indication of that when I talked about the Samaritan woman. All the implied reader knows is what has been told to him/her, it, probably better, right? I'd say the implied reader is an it. Been told it from chapter 1, verse 1. And so the implied reader is like a blank slate, right? And its knowledge is only given by what's been told it by the text. And so all it knows, is what the text has said to it so far. That's its knowledge base. Therefore, if you are writing an exegesis paper on the Samaritan woman, there in chapter 4, you can't talk about what's going to happen in chapter 5 to help understand the meaning of chapter 4, because the implied reader hasn't gotten there. You could talk about how the implied author will fill in some sort of narrative gap or provide more information, or this will become clearer to the implied reader when he gets to chapter 5 when he reads Acts. But you can't this means, for the implied reader, this means Y for him because of what's said in chapter 5. No, he hasn't gotten to chapter 5. In chapter 4, all he knows is what's up to chapter 4. Because that's kind of a crucial point of how you do narrative criticism, good narrative criticism. Because, again, I often find narrative critics violate this too. They'll sort of import information from later in the text. You're like, wait a minute, the implied reader, it doesn't have that knowledge yet. And so you can't sort of, shoehorn in later information from the gospel. Down the road, the implied reader could look back and say, oh, now I understand, John 4 better. But you can't say, oh, he understands X when reading John 4 because of what happens in chapter 11 or something like that. It's like, well, he hasn't gotten to chapter 11. How does he have that information? Right? So think of the implied reader as a blank slate, and all he knows is what he's been taught, right? What he's been by the text itself, what he's been informed about through the text itself. Okay, so even when he reads about that the Pharisees sent the priests and the Levites to go talk to John, he doesn't know what a Pharisee is. He's only right there in chapter 1. All he knows is, okay, they are people that send other people to talk to John. Over time, like we'll see here in a minute, he gets to chapter 3 and he finds out that Nicodemus is a Pharisee. That starts to fill in, well, what is a Pharisee? I get a better sense of who this class of people is. Okay, does that make sense? Hopefully it does. All right, so what are their methods? What's their approaches? I'd say here are the top 6. I'm going to push you to think about maybe just using the first 3 and maybe the rhetorical devices, but because they're the easiest one to use. But here are the kind of the major kind of tools they use, which is plot analysis. So then if people are doing plot analysis through a narrative critical lens, they examine the spatial temporal settings of the stories and how the narrative functions and the narrative functions of the story events themselves. So basically you're doing plot analysis. That seems pretty clear. Narrative graphs. This is really productive. I think this is one of the most insightful techniques of narrative criticism is the use of narrative gaps. And what they do is they examine how these gaps in the story work to create meaning for the implied reader. I just gave you a good example. What's a Pharisee? Well, when the first time the implied reader hears about Pharisees, he asks that question, what's a Pharisee? What's a Pharisee? So that moves the plot, and as more information has come, that narrative gap of what's a Pharisee starts to be filled in. Another good example is of a great narrative gap is that, it says in at the beginning of the gospel, towards the beginning of the gospel, that Jesus and his disciples go to baptize. And then one chapter later it says, but Jesus did not, after they're done baptizing, but Jesus did not baptize. So, you get this, well, first it says that Jesus and his disciples baptized. That seems to include Jesus. But then later on it says Jesus didn't baptize. So did Jesus baptize or not? That's a narrative gap. There's an inconsistency there. There's a question like, well, how am I to understand that? And good narrative criticism exploits that and says, so how's the text fill that gap? Does it ever fill the gap? Maybe it never fills the gap. But if it does, how does it fill the gap? How does the implied author give data or information that the implied reader can then use to fill that gap? So that's a really important method or tool. Characterization, you're probably very familiar with this and we're going to dig deeper into all these methods in a moment. But they, unlike what you might have done in high school or college, they use this terminology of full or round characters versus flat characters, and also trustworthy or reliable characters versus untrustworthy, unreliable characters, and also look at how these characters are developed. Again, we're going to unpack all these in a moment, so just kind of do a 20,000 foot here. The narrator, who's distinct from the implied author. The narrator is a character in the story, right? That's not the implied author. So the narrator, the one thing that some narrative critics will do is examine whether he's reliable or unreliable, right? So if he there's a good example about the baptism question. Does that raise within the implied reader a sense of, is this narrator reliable? Because earlier he told me Jesus was baptizing, then he tells me he wasn't. Can I trust this guy, right? And of course that affects how you read a text. You might have had this experience when you read mystery novels. Nothing's more frustrating than when you get to the end and there's a piece of information they never gave you that solves the mystery. And, you feel like, well, that's not fair. You should have dropped that somewhere so I could have put this together, right? And so therefore you feel like the author, in this case we're talking about who's speaking through the narrator's voice, because a lot of those mystery novels are, detective stories are being told in first person. You're like, well, that guy wasn't dependable because he didn't give me that information. He wasn't reliable. So that's what they're getting at. Okay. Also, is the narrator omniscient? Can he see things, outside of the current event happening or not? What's his limited vision, what have you? So narrative critics would probe that. How omniscient is this or not is the narrator? Rhetorical devices, that's using irony, paronomasia, that's word plays. Paronomasia. It's not a word I say often. Anyway, so word plays, irony, things like that, and how they function within the text in terms of their effect on the implied reader. And then perspective, so that's really looking at how the narrative itself, the perspective of the narrative. So from whose perspective is the story being told? Is it being told from the narrator's perspective? Is it being told from Jesus' perspective? Is it being told from the disciples' perspective? What perspective is there? Is it first or second or third person or second person? And what does that tell us about the meaning the text is trying to produce? What is the perspective suggest about the implied reader author's purpose in telling the story? Okay, so all those things would fit into perspective. Probably you won't delve into perspective. I think that's a little more complex. Okay, but let's go through the three that I think are most helpful for you to use in your papers. First would be plot analysis, and basically it analyzes the literary structure of the narrative by focusing on plot. So you look at things like where's the plot begin, climax, and end. What clues are there in the text that support the exegete's choice of the climax? How do you know that's the climax? Is it based upon the use of foreshadowing, repetition that builds in some way, identification of a crucial moment, which must be resolved in the stories of Dimonte? I shouldn't put words in that I can't say into my PowerPoints. So let me give you an example of this. I've been emphasizing that the story in the Gospel of John climaxes with the cross. And I've indicated it's foreshadowed over and over again whenever they talk about being lifted up and his hour. So there'd be an example of how you could argue that that's the climax. Another thing you could do within plot analysis is, are there antitheses present? So this could be, in some ways they can suggest meaning by presenting commentary on each other. So you can contrast one character with another character. You could parallel one story to another story. I made this claim with regard to the signs, that there's some parallel points, not so much antitheses, but parallels, and this sort of indicates something about the nature of what the meaning of the text is trying to communicate. But here you do it, I imported a lot of other a lot of historical information in that, like the nature of chiasms. You couldn't do a chiastic analysis within narrative criticism because the implied reader doesn't know what a chiasm is, right? How do we know about chiasms? We read contemporary cultural resources, documents that talk about that. Okay, so there's a good example of the difference between narrative criticism and what I'd call a tradition history study, which is what I think I was doing there with my chiastic analysis. All right. Another possibility, if you want to do plot analysis, is do there appear to be any anomalies in the text? Because anomalies are seen as indicating something about the meaning of the story. Interesting enough, right? Because within traditional historical criticism, anomalies or repetitions are seen as evidence of sources. Here they're like, oh no, there's something purposeful in those things. They're not accidental. They're trying to get at something. So, if you have a digression or interruption, what's the purpose of that? Thematic inconsistencies, what's the purpose of that? Or go right back to our baptism thing. There's a thematic inconsistency there. What's the point of that? Or apparent repetitions. Okay. Let me give you an example. I'm going to use John 3 throughout these couple of slides here as my example. So, example plot analysis, the role of Pharisees up to this point in John 3 in the narrative's plot. You could examine a narrative criticism could talk about what is the role of the Pharisees in moving the plot, in advancing the plot. Do they come at certain points, and affect the narrative? So you could examine the role of the Pharisees. That could be what you're focused on. And then when you get to John 3, you could talk about how the role of the Pharisees in moving the plot forward. Then you could look at the antithesis between Jesus and Nicodemus. In some ways there's parallel because Pharisees are senders, right? They sent the Levites and the priests to John the Baptist, while Jesus is the one sent. The Father sent him. So here we have the sort of an antithesis between Pharisees and Jesus. Or you could look at Nicodemus and how he engages with Jesus compared to the disciples. That would be an example of where, not to do characterization, that's something else, but just to talk about how the plot, how these figures, the Pharisees, fit into the plot, what their role is as understood by the implied reader, as created by the implied author. Okay, another possibility is narrative gaps, and I really like this technique. I think it's very fruitful from narrative criticism. So it examines the narrative gaps that the implied reader encounters in reading the story. I've given you some examples of that already. So a narrative gap analysis discusses the manner in which the implied author fills or leaves unfilled these narrative gaps, and how the filling of these gaps lead the implied reader to a particular understanding of the text meaning. Okay. And I kind of jumped the gun and started talking a lot about narrative gaps in the first slide about the methodology. So I think you get a sense of this. But how would they work with this within an exegetical study? Well, if the gap is left unfilled, then the tension created within the implied reader is then discussed. That's what a narrative exegetical paper might do. It's talk about how the implied reader, is trying to figure out, did Jesus baptize or not baptize? And this brings up the question of baptism for the implied reader. That, you could say maybe it gets filled into some degree or another as the narrative progresses. Okay? And so possible reasons for a narrative gap is to create anxiety within the implied reader. So again, that so that he looks for ways to fill it, and that's what would be discussed, how it is or isn't filled. Or it might be simply to drive the plot forward. Any good TV series always has a cliffhanger at the end of the season, right? To bring you back, So we just know this. This is how narratives work. That gaps makes you, again, maybe I'll go back to the detective novels. You're like, well, what's going on here? You got some information, but not all the information, and that keeps you interested, keeps you engaged, right? And that could simply be the function of narrative gaps, is it drives the narrative forward. And that might be the conclusion of the exegete. It's also, it could be the way they function is because, real readers, but in this case, implied readers fill these gaps in some ways. And then as they go along, the narrative will assess whether that's an accurate filling or an inaccurate filling for them. So they'll talk about that, how in fact, the implied reader might come to one conclusion and then farther down the road have to abandon that conclusion. A good example I'll give you from in a moment here. But the goal of this type of analysis is to see how narrative gaps function to force the implied reader to wrestle with the meaning of the text and to direct the implied reader to particular conclusions or insights. Yeah, so my example would be signs, that of a narrative gap. When Jesus changes the water into wine, everybody's amazed, and his glory is shown. And it seems like signs are a great thing. People start to believe in him, right? But then, in that same chapter, at the end of it, after the cleansing of the temple, Jesus says, or the narrator says, that Jesus did not trust himself for the people who believed in him because of his signs. So there's a narrative gap for the implied reader. Are signs a good thing or a bad thing? initially he probably thought they were a good thing. That would be the assumption based upon the positive reaction to Jesus' performance of the changing water into wine that's identified as a sign. But then the narrator says that Jesus didn't trust people who came to him just because they're signs. And then you take a look at the Nicodemus story in chapter 3, and Nicodemus says, truly you're a teacher, and because of the signs you've performed. So Nicodemus grants to Jesus a status and comes to him because of the signs he performed. So should we trust Nicodemus or not? Right? How does that dialogue with Nicodemus help the implied reader understand whether signs are good or bad? Because it's introduced with this idea of signs, because that's the first things out of Nicodemus's mouth is, that these signs that he's doing are a sign of Jesus' specialness. Okay, so you get the idea. That's how narrative gaps would work. A next method would be characterization. You might be, again, familiar with this from your undergraduate English classes or even from high school. You take a character and talk about the nature of the character, kind of how he develops in the narrative, kind of his personality, his or her personality. But narrative criticism really approaches it from a little different angle. That's not what they do per se. I mean, that's not the classical narrative critical way of doing characterization. So do it if you're going to do characterization, do it this way that I'm about to talk about, which is they talk about round versus flat characters. So round characters are those whose inner thoughts and feelings are revealed, right? So that's a round character. Flat characters are those that whose inner thoughts and feelings are not revealed, and they tend to simply function as foils. So, one narrative critical approach would be, is Nicodemus a round character, or is he a flat character in this encounter between the two of them? And same thing with Jesus. Do we get any sense of Jesus' inner thoughts or of his emotions? If not, he's a flat character. What is that saying? Or no, we do get a sense of that. So he is a round character. How round is he? So the implied reader is drawn to associate, according in narrative critical framework, the implied reader is drawn to associate more with round characters because they are more emotionally accessible. And identification of round characters typically indicate the characters the implied author desires the implied reader to most strongly connect with and understand. Okay? Which is sort of interesting because I think there's a big question just from a narrative critical perspective. How round is Jesus? Right? From my very first lecture, I talk about how I kind of perceived the Jesus in the Gospel of John as faceless. Right? And I think there's a reason for that because of his high Christology. But not to go down that road too far, but from a narrative critical perspective, then technically, if I'm right, which I might not be right on that, but for using their methodology, if I was using their methodology, I might come to a different conclusion. But using their methodology, and if I were to come to that conclusion, then does that mean that we're not supposed to associate with Jesus? Well, maybe so, because there's a distance between us and Jesus. That might be why Jesus portrayed as more of a flat character. Or no, he's actually round. Okay, so that you get the idea there. So again, you could do this with Nicodemus. Which one is round, which one is flat, or both round or both flat. You can also talk about reliable and unreliable characters. So can you trust Jesus when he says things? And how would you demonstrate that the implied reader has come to trust Jesus, right, and starts to see him as a reliable character? How about the Samaritan woman? Is she trustworthy? If you're doing an analysis of that pericope. So reliable characters are those who tell the truth and who are deemed trustworthy by the implied reader. Narrative critical analyses of characterizations will discuss how the implied author constructs the narrative so as to inform the implied reader about which character is reliable versus those who are unreliable. Right, so is Nicodemus reliable? He's a Pharisee. At this point, the implied reader doesn't, he saw that the people that the Pharisees sent were somewhat confrontational with John the Baptist, but they didn't seem to be highly problematic. And now here comes Nicodemus. He's confused, but he's not antagonistic. He's looking for answers. He may have the implied reader has some understanding about who Jesus is, that because he knows the prologue. So it clearly, Nicodemus' understanding of Jesus is inadequate, but so were some of the disciples' claims about Jesus. So we wouldn't have to have a negative perspective about Pharisees when we encounter Nicodemus. Down the road, we probably will, right? But at this point, no. And so that'd be what a characterization would be. Then, therefore, would Nicodemus be seen as a trustworthy character? Or maybe that's an open question. Is he a reliable character? And maybe that's one we don't get the answer until chapter 19. Maybe, that'd be a narrative critical analysis. The implied reader does not get the answer to that question of whether or not, if they say it's ambiguous, if you can make that claim. If you want to argue that, you'd have to use the data from the text and say it's only when Nicodemus shows up to bury Jesus that the implied reader would come to see Nicodemus as reliable, maybe. Something like that. So see how you can do narrative criticism using these categories of round, flat, reliable, unreliable. Okay, so if you want to read some examples, here's some that are in our library. Kaiser, it's okay, but just to give you an example of I think Kaiser sometimes slips into doing, sometimes slips in non-narrative material because he started off as a historical critic, so some of his historical stuff sort of seeps in. But anyway, so I think Stibbe actually does a better job. So, but I give you all these in a couple references dealing with John and narrative criticism. You can see that Kaiser book's in '84. Stibbe was writing in the '90s, so he's kind of the second generation of narrative critics. Kaiser would be in that first batch because really narrative criticism started with Rhodes and Michie. Their book, Market Story, is kind of the foundational work that started within biblical studies, narrative criticism. That's gone through 3 editions now, and they added another author, Joanna Dewey, with their second and third edition. But their original edition was published in 1982, and that's actually really good. It does a nice job of doing narrative criticism. It's well worth reading, an easy read. I'd pick up particularly the 1982 original version, which is in the library too. The call number here is for the most recent edition. All right, so now we've gone through those steps. We can get down to how do you actually write the paper. So you have to write a narrative analysis of one of the scrutiny gospels, which will also include a pastoral application section dealing with the RCIA program, right? The student will have the opportunity to rewrite the paper if you want to raise your assigned grades. So this is a new method. I give you 2 bites at the apple. You can do, and I'll walk through those in a minute. So you have to use a narrative critical analysis. You have to focus on one of these 3 scrutiny gospels, right? Either John 4, John 9, or John 11. It has to be a minimum of 5 pages. I don't put a maximum, but preferably don't go past 10. That's gonna be too much work for you, and that's way beyond what you need. But 5 is, the minimum. That is, assuming you're going to use 12-point New Times Roman type, double spaced. I should have put that up here, and 1-inch margins. It must be submitted by 11/59 on the required date on the syllabus as a Word document via the Populi assignment page. You can submit a draft 2 weeks in advance of the due date, and I will give you feedback. I'll also tell you what I would see as the grade of that paper as it stands at that point, so you can decide, I got an A, so why rewrite any of it unless you really want to impress me? I got an AB, okay, well, with all your other demands, you're going to be comfortable with that, whatever. Or no, it's an AB, I want to get the A, and I'll give you the comments that would indicate how you'd get up to that A. And vice versa, if you submit it, once you submit it for the deadline, if you're not happy with the grade that's given to it, you do have a chance to rewrite it. Okay? Because I do know this is a method that's new, so I'll give you a couple chances to refine your understanding of it. You don't have to do any outside research. In fact, don't do any outside research. It'll just mess you up. everything you need is on the Populi site. Use this sort of SUNY generously. Don't forget that RCIA application, right? So the scrutiny gospels are when you have in your parish adults who are preparing for baptism on Easter, you're to go use these 3 gospels during the scrutiny rites on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Sunday of Lent. They supersede whatever other gospels, no matter what the year is. These take priority in the scrutiny rites, or used in the scrutiny rites, and you have to use them if you do have somebody preparing for baptism as an adult. So I want you to have an application section that has a pastoral application pointed towards people who are going through the RCIA process. It can be a homily, but act like you're preaching where you have just led the RCIA catechumens through the scrutinies. It could be a page or so or longer, but make sure that your pastoral application is congruent with and built on your exegesis. That's what primarily we're going to be looking at. How consistent is the exegesis and the pastoral application? If they seem like, well, I don't see how the pastoral application has anything to do with what you just did in your narrative critical paper, that's going to have an impact on the grade. All right. So how to write your narrative critical paper. First off, you select one of those 3 pericopes and your paper's primary narrative exegetic lens, whether you're going to use plot analysis, narrative gaps, or characterization. I would suggest that you don't use more than 1 or 2 of those. Whenever I've gotten papers that use a bunch of them, they kind of fail. All right? So try to decide 1 or 2 kind of main lenses, like narrative gaps. Maybe you can do characterization and you're also going to use narrative gaps, something like that. But don't go to like all 3 of these. It's just too many. And I'd pick 1 ideally. But you might, more, rhetorical devices might slip in there or whatever, just based upon the text you're dealing with. But try to keep it pretty much focused on 1 lens and no more than 2. So after you've picked your passage and your lens, then you analyze it. And I have posted, and we can go to that. Oops, sorry. Now get me out of the way again. Well, I'm always in the way. Okay. And show. If we go here, then simply go to lessons, go to coursework explanation, go to narrative paper directions, and as you scroll down, you'll see here, I give you a couple examples of narrative past papers, but here I have a document, and as you scroll through this one, you'll see I give you sort of these tools you can use. So here's my plot tool, and use these to the degree they're helpful. I have a narrative gap tool, I have a characterization tool. So these are just meant, if they're helpful, great. If they're not, don't worry about it. But these are meant to give you some, kind of resource so you can kind of figure out how to write this kind of paper. All right, now from Chris. So you can use those to kind of determine and analyze the passage. Then next thing you're going to do is construct the exegetical lines of argumentation about how the implied reader comes to a particular understanding of the pericope's meaning based upon the implied author's use of plot, gaps, characterization, rhetorical device, perspective, etc., whatever lens you're using. So this is basically your rough draft. Then hopefully you have already have defined your thesis before you did that step 3. But I often find that for sure students will refine their thesis. I do. I certainly find that I end up refining my thesis after I've done the first draft. You might not even be quite sure what is my thesis, but if you write that first draft, then okay, here's the main point, and then you have to go back. Right? Step 5 is rewrite the paper so that every paragraph is essentially essential in verifying and substantiating the paper's overarching thesis. If you have a paragraph that doesn't advance your argument, get rid of it. The thesis should drive the paper. Once you figure out what your thesis is, then everything in your paper should be supporting and verifying that thesis. If you can't read a paragraph and say, what relevance does this have to do with my thesis? It shouldn't be in your paper. That's simple. Then after you finish, basically your major rewrite, and only then would I suggest you write your pastoral application section, because now you know what the point of the paper is. Now you can write a good pastoral application. Okay? So that'd be my recommendation, is you wait until then to write your pastoral application. Then I'd give your penultimate draft to a colleague or to me, if you get it to me 2 weeks in advance, and get feedback and corrections. This is standard practice for writing papers. I never present a paper or submit a paper for publication who hasn't been seen by a couple eyes, right? People see things I never see. It always makes the paper better. So try to help each other out and read each other's papers. And then after you've gotten that feedback, revise it and then submit it via Populi. Okay, and you're done. Yay! Here's the assessment criteria. As I say here, assessment is sequential. In other words, the BC level competencies and the B level competencies must both be present to receive a B. And the BC level competencies and the B level competencies and the AB level competencies must be present to receive an AB. So you get the idea here. These are sequential. You have to do the lower skills to get the higher grade. So what's a BC paper? Well, it fulfills the basic requirements of sufficiently employing a narrative critical categories and contains a pastoral application. A B level is that the paper discusses the material from the pericope in a manner that demonstrates a solid understanding of narrative criticism's exegetical techniques, and also has a pastoral application that's consistent with the paper's exegetical analysis. AB is that it's exegetically building a convincing case to justify its narrative critical assessment of the pericope's themes, purposes, or goals, and the paper's pastoral application is drawn from and builds upon the paper's exegetical analysis. And then A is the paper explores the dynamic function of the pericope by isolating and validating an insightful thesis through narrative critical analysis. The paper's pastoral application is insightfully derived from the narrative critical analysis. Okay, so those are they're kind of broad, general, but it gives you an idea of what distinguishes A paper from a B paper. All right, good. So hopefully that's helpful. If you have any questions about narrative criticism, if you have any questions about the paper, please feel free to reach out to me. I will certainly make myself available. Hope this has been helpful. We'll talk to you later. Bye.